Hi, this is Todd James Pierce, and as longtime listeners know, as it's January, we're now moving back into our regular topics, starting with two lengthy, complex updates about the state of the Disney Company as we begin 2024. This week, we'll have the big overview focused on large issues and concerns for the Disney Company. We'll touch down with parks, films, TV, and we'll move through the C-suite in Burbank and discuss the current state of the company, its present challenges and problems, and where I think things are headed in the next year. Today, we have a long, expansive episode that moves through many elements of the Disney empire, and by long and expansive, I mean that the script for our episode today clocks in at 6,000 words, which also means we'll cover a lot of ground, largely by focusing on key struggles for Bob Iger and the Disney Company. And then next Sunday, we'll return with part 2 of our January update, where we look at specific changes within the Disney Company, including new additions to the Florida resort and updates on the battle over Reedy Creek. At our house, the gifts now are all unwrapped. A couple have been returned. The tree is still up, but we're already talking about when to take it down. And as usual, we're disagreeing as to who needs to box up the light strings that we've put up outside along the edge of our roof. And I'm still waiting for that Disney Pendleton blanket I bought on an after-Christmas sale to show up at my door, as my son has now claimed the couch blanket that I've used for years as his own. But as for our podcast here, the end of Christmas week means one important thing. We're putting the 2023 holidays into the rearview mirror, and we're back to business as usual. I've enjoyed some much-needed sleep over the break. The day after Christmas, I even took a 2-hour nap, which was absolutely fabulous. For our podcast, I've started to plan out a couple new mini-series for 2024, as we are now nearly done with the one on Herb Ryman. And more to the point today, I'm back to piecing together the ongoing story of the Disney Company as we move into the new year. And I imagine that many of you are also right in this same space, ready to take down the stockings and get back into all the news and intrigue that surrounds the Disney Company as we say farewell to 2023 and step into this new year. So, if you're ready to jump into all of these stories, here we go. On the day that I edit up this script, which is the start of the day on Friday, December 29th, Disney stock is selling for $90. This means that for the entry and exit points of 2023, the stock price is nearly flat. It started the year at $89 and at least as of this morning, looks to be on track to end the year at $90, which is not a great year for any company, especially when the S&P 500 is up 21% for the year. If Disney were simply matching the S&P 500 for the year, the stock would presently be selling for about $108. This is to say nothing of how other streaming companies have fared. Amazon is up nearly 80%, Netflix is up nearly 65%, and Apple is up 55%. In fairness, I should point out that theater chains are doing far worse than Disney. AMC's stock price fell over 80% during 2023 as theaters in general continued to struggle post-COVID. But for months, the Disney stock price has been hovering in the range of $80 to $90. For a while this past month, the stock price saw some minor gains. Part of its upward pressure was due to Disney announcing a cash dividend for the first time in over 3 years since it was suspended at the start of the pandemic. It's smaller than the traditional half-yearly dividend. It's just 30 cents, payable on January 10th, but the announcement has helped fuel some small upward movement. Shortly after the announcement of the dividend, the stock price rose to $96, but then quickly retreated to $91. Many stock analysts remain positive on Disney. Philip Cusick of JP Morgan recently placed a price target on the stock of $120, which is a 30% increase, and Jessica Reif Ehrlich of Bank of America put a price target on the stock of $110. At the moment, year to date, Disney is up less than 2% for the past 12 months, which has irritated some key investors. The underlying problem for Disney at the moment remains media. TV, streaming, and theatrical, all of which are underperforming. And this is a significant problem for Disney. Disney films, TV, and streaming provide intellectual properties that allow other business areas within the company to grow and flourish. For example, the success of The Mandalorian created a path for endless consumer products, from Christmas tree ornaments to plush, which together sold millions of retail units in stores, online, and at the parks. The success of that same show also allowed for the parks to create a very popular walk-around character from the series to greet guests, which supports revenue from tickets, hotels, and restaurants at the resorts. There's a trickle-down effect here. Media has always been the engine that creates properties that can be exploited by the parks, publishing, and consumer products. But if Disney isn't producing stories that deeply connect with the public through film or TV, then in a few months, consumer products may see a downturn in revenue, and in a few years, the same may happen at the parks. That is, stories are the engine that drive this company. I don't think that ex-CEO Bob Chapek ever understood how stories affected most people, the way that viewers and readers could pleasurably lose themselves in an inventive realm or with compelling characters. Chapek also appeared to have little idea as to how to develop a story that would deeply connect with viewers, but he did understand that successful characters and stories drove the larger Disney business model. He would often express these ideas in language that appeared cribbed from a marketing textbook. At one time he said, "We have the best brands and franchises in the world," which also suggested that he didn't grasp why some stories connected with an audience and others didn't. But he was absolutely right that storytelling elements were the key components that drove most of the company. And that's the issue that Disney is having right now. First, creating stories that connect with a large audience, and second, finding effective delivery and distribution options that allow for a mass audience to connect with Disney properties in a world post-COVID. The Disney global box office has shrunk considerably during and after the pandemic. In 2019, Disney Theatrical took in just over $11 billion at the global box office, which is a huge figure. Admittedly, I'm adding up Disney's global box office for the current year on December 28th, meaning there's still a few days left in 2023, but at this moment, Disney's global box office take for the year is just over $3 billion. That's an $8 billion decline. Disney's highest performing film for the year, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, took in about $850 million, which was a solid entry. But from a financial and review standpoint, many other films floundered, particularly Indiana Jones, Elemental, The Marvels, Haunted Mansion, and Wish. I would like to point out that if you haven't seen Elemental, it's well worth the watch. And personally, I enjoyed Haunted Mansion more than I thought I would, mainly how it played with narrative elements from the attraction, but I will admit that this is probably more a matter of personal preference than anything else. But as a group, in terms of review metrics, these films together mark a falling off from many films that Disney released in 2019. Wish, for example, which was released just over a month ago on November 22nd, is now at exactly one theater within 100 miles of my house during the week after Christmas, which is prime time for family fare. And at that one theater, Wish has only one daily showtime at 1:20 p.m., which makes it essentially a kiddie matinee. Wish cost around $200 million to produce, and so far, globally, it's taken in around $146 million, which Disney splits with theaters, meaning that there is little chance that even with home media and streaming, the film will produce a profit. Simply, the much-anticipated media rebound of 2023 never happened, and at this point I think media distribution and production needs to evolve before the industry as a whole recovers, but that evolution is not yet happening. There's a number of reasons why Disney didn't do well at the box office this past year, even though back in 2022, some of these films were discussed inside the company as surefire hits, such as Indiana Jones and The Marvels. Here's part of the current problem. Those films that presently bring people out to the multiplex aren't in genres where Disney excels. For the past decade, Disney has focused on franchise sequels and superhero films. But those two areas have fallen short this past year, not just for Disney, but for all studios. The two notable exceptions were Across the Spider-Verse and Guardians of the Galaxy. Bob Iger's take on this problem is different than my take. Iger has listed a few reasons why some of these films fell flat at the box office. At a New York Times Business Summit, he explained that The Marvels was an outlier. The Marvels was shot during COVID, he told the audience. There wasn't as much supervision on the set, so to speak, where we have executives that are really looking over what's being done day after day after day. But personally, having seen The Marvels, I think the issues here are a little deeper than on-set supervision. There are script problems that make this film feel far from the tone of any other Marvel production. For those of you who have yet to see it, without giving too much away, there's a planet where its inhabitants can only communicate by singing their thoughts in the style of Broadway musicals. So yes, there are comic musical numbers in this picture, and this seems, at least to me, far more like a parody of a Marvel property rather than part of the ongoing development of a successful Marvel franchise. Here's my take. The solution here isn't to have more executives on set. I can't think of a single picture where that solved meaningful problems. The solution I would propose is to reconfigure the current process of story development. I see this as an issue that crosses over to other Disney projects, both in live action and animation. And this idea, from a certain perspective, is something that should appeal to Bob Iger. In Bob Iger's book, The Ride of a Lifetime, and in various talks that he's given, he has discussed how he admires the film Jiro Dreams of Sushi, which is the documentary story about an 85-year-old sushi chef who owns a 10-seat restaurant in a subway station in Tokyo. But despite the restaurant's modest location, it received 3 Michelin stars and has a deep following around the world. After I read Iger's book a few years ago, I found a Blu-ray copy of this film and watched it so I could better understand this influence. Iger typically points to Jiro, who has focused his entire adult life on improving his skills as a sushi chef so he can better satisfy his customers. Iger thinks that this is a highly successful model of employment, but in the film, Jiro also points to other individuals who contribute to his restaurant's success, mainly individuals with expertise in fish and rice. Jiro explains that there are only a few sellers, one for tuna, one for halibut, another for rice, and so on, that he has come to rely on to elevate the food quality at his restaurant because these people have abilities in food selection beyond his own. And that generally is what I think needs to happen here with Disney film and TV productions. The process, especially early on, needs more people with expertise. Specifically, it needs more people truly gifted with narrative, and it probably needs less people gifted in areas of business management. And beyond this, in terms of last year's slate of movies, there's also a relatively easy way for Iger to push past most of the disappointments. Though the public has a short memory, most of what we have seen this past year was developed or finalized during Chapek's problematic reign as CEO. Chapek was not a leader who had a strong grasp of narrative. In many ways, I think it would be relatively easy for Iger to pin most of this past year's mess on Chapek and then announce that the studio is revising its script development process, ideally with people whose background is in scripts, novels, or narrative, not in business. In terms of a historical perspective here, one of the key elements that elevated Disney animation in the 1930s over that of other studios was Walt's reliance on a story department to develop and deeply revise scripts, or more accurately, storyboards, which functioned as visual scripts in the 1930s, before layout artists and animators began their work. In the early 1930s, no other animation studio had a similar story development process. I think many fans think visually of characters when they imagine early Disney projects such as Snow White or Mickey Mouse. But beneath lovely character designs, beneath all that impressive animation, and beneath those stunning backgrounds was the strong backbone of narrative. Some animation produced in the 1930s and 1940s by Disney's biggest rival, the Fleischer Brothers, is visually stunning, but it often lacks the strong emotional narrative center of Disney's best works. And the path to more successful cartoons and features, as Walt understood it, was not with more managers, but with individuals who specialized in the construction of compelling stories. And not that anyone is asking me about this, but that, I think, is the path forward here, one that also ties in to that documentary that Bob Iger also admires. But there's a second half to this equation that is also equally important. Even if Disney, or really any studio, can put together a film that has the ability to connect with a mass audience, is there still a reliable release and distribution structure that will bring millions of people into theaters to see it? The answer here, I think, is not an absolute no, but it's fairly close to that. Warner Brothers was able to pull in quite an audience for Barbie, but that looks to be far more the exception at the moment than anything that studios can bank on, even if they have a strong narrative project. Again, Disney's global box office fell from $11 billion to $3 billion from 2019 to 2023. Sure, some of that, even a large portion of that, is likely attributable to less polished films, but the overall drop-off underscores that traditional theaters simply no longer have the audience that they did 4 years ago. The audience has moved elsewhere, mainly to their living rooms. And though maybe we'll see some small upticks in theatrical business in future years, probably not in 2024 due to the strikes, there's still a rocky road ahead. At the moment, there's very few big-budget films anticipated for 2024. There's Dune 2, Deadpool 3, and a film that takes place in the world of Mad Max. But beyond that, many high-profile projects once earmarked for 2024, such as Mission Impossible 8 and Captain America New World Order, have been bumped to 2025. So 2024 looks like another year where theater chains will be scrambling for content and hoping that an outlier film proves to be a hit. This past year, that is 2023, theaters were so starved for business that in terms of the domestic box office, a presentation of Taylor Swift's tour ended up being the 11th highest grossing film of 2023, beating out, among others, the new Indiana Jones film. Really, let that sink in for a moment. A video presentation of Swift's concert, which had a projected production cost of under $20 million, beat out the new Indiana Jones film, which had an estimated production cost of $300 million. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny was modestly reviewed. It ended up with 70% on Rotten Tomatoes, which isn't bad, but also isn't great. But more importantly, even as it was released, everyone knew that it would soon show up on Disney+, whereas at the time of its release, no one knew where or when or even if the Swift footage would end up for home viewing. The big studios have simply trained many viewers to stay home and wait for a film to show up on streaming. I don't think that there's any way to bring back a 2019-style audience into cinemas on a regular basis, especially when viewers know that studios need theatrical content to support their streamers. Iger is aware of these problems. Placing a positive spin on these issues, he said, we got to the point where if a film didn't do $1 billion in global box office, we were disappointed. That's an unbelievably high standard, and I think we have to get more realistic. And part of being realistic here, I think, means that the distribution infrastructure that produced multiple billion-dollar hits for Disney in a single year is gone, and it likely isn't coming back. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other delivery options where films and series might find tremendous returns in the near future. So the big question for Disney and other studios is this: how can the quality of storytelling in films and miniseries improve in the coming year or two? And how can various distribution models be changed to increase audience levels and profits for future projects, be that streaming or perhaps some other delivery mechanism? What I repeatedly see studio executives doing at Disney and elsewhere is chasing after past distribution models, trying to make 2023 or 2024 work like 2019, and I think it's going to require more inventive thought to create spaces where strong films have an opportunity to connect with mass audiences. And this, I think, is the true challenge of the moment. But that flat stock price has again set the scene for activist investor Nelson Peltz and Trian Fund Management to launch an effort again to put two people, Nelson Peltz himself plus ex-Disney executive Jay Rasulo, on the Disney board, which is more or less where we were at this point last year. In ways, investor activism is easy to understand at the moment, as other streaming and media companies are doing so much better right now compared to Disney. And this is the ongoing saga of Nelson Peltz. Last year, Nelson Peltz, in support of his requested board seat, set up a website called Restore the Magic, where he laid out goals that he would pursue if he or one of his surrogates was placed on the Disney board. Near the top of his list last year, he insisted that Disney cut operating costs. And Disney did just this. Bob Iger cut $7.5 billion in operating costs, largely by laying off thousands of employees and as a result causing months of anxiety inside Disney offices. Once Disney agreed to reduce its workforce, Peltz's challenge to Disney was largely relinquished as its material demands were met. This time, however, Peltz's objections are more general, citing poor performance of Disney offerings and also deep critiques of Disney's purchase of Fox, which has led, in Peltz's estimation, to a reduced value of the Disney stock price. Specifically, Peltz believes that the company needs to move beyond the acquisition idea framework of Iger, though he doesn't yet have a long list of specific concerns. By citing general concerns this time, as opposed to specific areas last time, it will be more difficult for Iger to put out the fire by making specific changes to Disney operations. Once more, Nelson Peltz has paired up with former Marvel executive Ike Perlmutter to present his dissatisfaction with the Disney company, largely over business issues. As longtime listeners here will recall, Perlmutter's role was marginalized at Disney after his clashes with rising star Kevin Feige, who oversees the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Essentially, Iger said that Feige would manage those films, not Perlmutter, a strategy that produced many hits over a few years. More recently, though, Perlmutter was laid off as part of Peltz's requested downsizing of the company this past year. Presently, with Perlmutter's shares, the Trian effort controls about $3 billion of Disney stock. The twist this year is that Peltz has also teamed up with Jay Rasulo, who at one point was one of Iger's longtime lieutenants at Disney. At various points, Jay Rasulo has been the CFO of Disney, a senior executive vice president, and chairman of the Walt Disney Parks and Resorts, but his career is mostly tied to being an executive overseeing the parks and resorts. Recently, though, he's emerged as a critic of the company. After his name was put forward by Trian for a seat on the Disney board, Rasulo released a statement explaining his nomination. "The Disney I know and love has lost its way," he said. "As independent voices in the boardroom, Nelson Peltz and I are confident that the combination of my decades of experience at Disney, Nelson's significant boardroom skills and history of driving positive strategic change, and our combined consumer brand's expertise and financial acumen will be additive to the Disney board." Board members at Disney are voted into their positions by stockholders. It would be easy for Iger to again dismiss Peltz as an outsider with little knowledge of the Disney business model, but it would be nearly impossible to do the same to Jay Rasulo, as 9 years ago, Jay Rasulo and Tom Staggs were seen as the most likely candidates to become the next CEO after Bob Iger's retirement. That is, until Jay Rasulo left the company in 2015. Rasulo left after Tom Staggs was promoted to the Chief Operating Officer, which signaled that Staggs was being groomed for the CEO position, not Rasulo himself. But Rasulo didn't leave on bad terms, and this is the difference between the two ex-executives involved in this renewed campaign, Rasulo and Perlmutter. Perlmutter was laid off during the downsizing requested by Peltz, and yes, cue the ironic music of revenge and discontentment right here. But Rasulo left as an executive when he no longer saw a viable path forward to becoming CEO. Iger is on the record as praising Rasulo's abilities. He has described Jay Rasulo as having strategic acumen and savvy insight. He's also claimed that Rasulo has been a vital contributor to Disney's success in the 2000s and early 2010s, which was a period of substantial company growth. With this, there's the possibility that in the coming months we'll see clashes between Iger and Peltz, likely also Rasulo, in terms of how Disney should be managed moving forward, particularly if the Disney share price remains in the $80 or $90 range. Or to put all of this in very straightforward terms, in the Disney corner, we have Bob Iger and a board that has been supportive of him, and in the Trian corner, we now have Nelson Peltz, who has been openly critical of Iger for years, Perlmutter, who was laid off by Iger, and Jay Rasulo, who was passed over for promotion by Iger years ago. So essentially, there's the pro-Iger and anti-Iger camps. It's possible that Peltz and Rasulo will both find seats on the board, or it's possible, and a little more likely, that Rasulo might find a seat, thereby cutting off Peltz, who is a far more vocal critic of Iger. But the election of either of them might make it more difficult for Iger to extend his term again as CEO if in fact the cards fall that way. But we won't know the answer to these questions until the shareholders meeting, which will be held at a yet-to-be-announced date in 2024, which is typically early in the spring. In terms of looking at the overall state of the Disney company, I'd like to repeat an observation that I made back in November, as I believe it still holds true. Even with decreased attendance in the Florida parks, the American Disney resorts are doing well enough at the moment, reliably producing a profit, particularly with Genie Plus selling out in Florida at $39 per person over the winter holidays. To lift the Disney company up out of the $80 or $90 range, something needs to happen to challenge the immediate future of streaming, linear TV, or theatrical releases. In my opinion, the three most likely points where theatrical might turn itself around in 2024 are with Inside Out 2, Deadpool 3, or Mufasa. The first two come out in summer, the last next Christmas. All of them are slotted for after the shareholders' meeting. In terms of linear TV, it's possible that Disney might sell off ESPN or even ABC, which would lighten the company's burden in terms of a changing media landscape and also bring in much-needed cash. I would wager that Disney has already seriously discussed this option with possible buyers, particularly for ESPN, but that offers so far made or explored aren't yet high enough to close a deal. Iger's thoughts on linear TV have changed multiple times this year, but at one point back in July, he said that linear TV such as ABC and ESPN may not be core to Disney's business model moving forward. If the sale of ESPN in the near future was not a realistic possibility, it would make little sense for Disney to keep ESPN in its own division, separated from the other Disney-owned linear networks. It's there in its own division almost surely to make it easy to spin off. And now on to streaming. Streaming, I think, is the most difficult area for Disney to change quickly. The path forward here is to both grow the subscriber base and to gradually increase subscription rates, both of which are presently happening but not nearly fast enough to produce a meaningful change early in 2024. Right now, subscription fees are too low at their current levels to pay for content, but it's going to take many small price increases, likely put out there gradually each fall, to move the service to a point where fees fully cover programming. Beyond this, again, 2024 may prove to be a difficult year for Disney Plus, as some upcoming series, due to the writers and actors strikes, have been moved back from 2024 to 2025. And this brings us up to the fallout from the Spectrum Charter cable deal with Disney Plus. Over in cable, the landscape is continuing to change as cable providers attempt to become bundling services for streamers, not just for cable channels. The original plan for Disney Plus was to create a system whereby Disney collected money directly from consumers, bypassing the chunk historically absorbed by both cable providers and by theater owners. If Disney could distribute some or perhaps most of its content directly, it would ideally see higher profits and also could offer programming at a discount to direct consumers, as it would no longer need to share revenue with cable or theater owners. But one aspect of this plan partially fell apart when Charter Cable played hardball with Disney over the rights to bundle and distribute an ad-supported version of Disney Plus as part of its cable package for subscribers. For 10 days back in September, Disney content was shut out of Charter's offerings until the two companies reached a deal. Charter understood that many of its customers were cutting ties with cable to move to all streaming options, which then forced Charter to look for ways to move streaming inside of its business model. The new Charter model is not just to bundle cable channels like CNN and ESPN, but to bundle streamers such as Disney Plus and possibly in the near future, Paramount Plus or Apple Plus. The original cable model from decades ago was financially viable because cable companies forced millions of subscribers to pay a little for each channel, whether or not those subscribers watched those channels or not. And that essentially is the game plan here as well, but to do the same with streamers. Recently, CFO of Charter Communications, Jessica Fisher, explained that the Disney Plus deal was the model for how her company wanted to work with other streamers moving forward. But in all of this, there's now also the possibility of Disney Plus becoming a distributor. Disney is already exploring ways to rebundle its current content with the Disney Plus Hulu integration plan by mixing some Hulu content into Disney Plus and by more aggressively marketing Disney Plus Hulu packages and by upselling current Disney Plus subscribers to Hulu bundles. Due to licensing agreements, Disney Plus can't port over all of Hulu's content, but it it can include some of it inside the Disney Plus app, which perhaps will broaden the appeal of the Disney Plus service. The strategy here is that even if customers aren't interested in this month's Disney Plus offerings, they may be interested in some of Hulu's content that filters through Disney Plus, which will keep them from canceling their subscriptions. But beyond this, there's that basic bundling strategy. If customers are subscribed to a bundle, they can't easily cancel just one part of that service, which should reduce churn. But there's something else that is lightly in the mix here right now as well. Beyond bundling content that Disney already controls into a type of mini-hub service that resembles a small cable package, it's possible that at some point in the near future, Disney Plus or Netflix or Amazon might take over the role of a full cable company by creating a streaming-only bundled service to challenge cable entirely, with more money going to the studios than to middleman outfits like Charter. Studios have worked together previously, such as with the original version of Hulu and with Movies Anywhere, when the project is for their mutual advantage. So it's possible that one of the streamers here might take a page from Charter, or that multiple streamers together might create a mega bundle that for many would entirely replace cable. In this, one of the major streamers, or perhaps a few of them, might ultimately end up in the distribution business, much like cable in the 1980s or 1990s. The battle for who controls the future of bundled streaming, or if it remains mostly an a la carte affair, is likely a story that will play out in the next 2 years. Beyond small and large-scale bundling, Disney is also exploring ways to change the streaming service with other revenue options. Disney is considering adding gaming to its streaming service. It's also exploring the possibility of integrated direct shopping. Perhaps after The Mandalorian, viewers might see a QR code on screen that they could use with their phones to visit an online store to buy Mandalorian merchandise. The public-facing details on this are still a little fuzzy, but Disney has said that they plan to talk about this at the CES show in Las Vegas early in 2024. This may be another effective way that Disney increases revenue from Disney Plus, moving the platform more quickly to a cost-neutral business, which would then allow Disney to more deeply invest in other areas of the company, particularly in parks and resorts. But the shifting landscape of linear TV and streaming also brings up a related question. Who will lead Disney into this new world in which theatrical and linear are less important and streaming emerges as the center of the American media model? At the moment, Bob Iger is 72 years old, which admittedly is younger than the two leading candidates for the next presidential election in the U.S. So, with advances in medicine and health planning, 72 isn't exactly what it used to be. Over the past 2 decades, Iger has made tentative plans to retire many times, only to repeatedly extend his term as CEO. His presumed retirement date presently is 2026. But if the issues between theatrical, streaming, and linear remain the central concern at the company in 2025, I can easily see Iger again extending his term as CEO specifically to fix the company's current problems with media distribution. At the top of the list of people likely to succeed Iger are Tom Staggs, Kevin Mayer, and Josh D'Amaro, whose collective experience is more focused on parks, technology, and acquisitions, which are not the area where Disney most needs to show improvement. Iger is presently including Staggs and Mayer as consultants when planning the future of Disney Plus, particularly overseas. But streaming and linear TV are largely Iger's specialty. He has deep experience with linear TV from ABC and streaming as he started the process at Disney, and perhaps to a slightly lesser extent with theatrical strategies. But Iger's key areas are better matched with those areas where Disney needs to develop, evolve, and expand than they are with people that are in line to replace him. But to talk about Iger's long-range plans right now is to jump ahead of the current moment. But if the problems with streaming, linear, and theatrical continue to hobble the company through 2024, I see a growing possibility that Iger will again extend his tenure as CEO specifically to overcome these issues. And if these remain the key concerns, I'm having trouble right now, at least, seeing a strong candidate to replace him as we move forward. So, as we finish up our January update, maybe a few things to recap. As I recorded this today, the Disney stock briefly dipped down into the $89 range, but it closed out the year at $90.29, which is almost exactly where the stock started off back at the start of 2023. But there are some bright spots ahead. This past week on Disney Plus and Hulu, Percy Jackson received over 13 million viewers during the first 6 days it was on the two services. The parks, both in California and Florida, continue to be profit centers. Disney seems committed to invest $60 billion in the parks, experiences, and products, with the lion's share of that money going to the Florida and California resorts. But to have available funds for this type of capital expansion, Disney first needs to move its streamer to a point where it is not losing money. That is, to a point where Disney Plus is not taking money from other areas of the company, particularly the parks and resorts, to balance its books. And that, I think, is coming. Maybe not by the end of September 2024 as promised by the company, but sometime in the next few years after multiple rounds of repricing, better control of production costs, and higher subscription levels come to pass for Disney Plus. More significantly, after his first year back as CEO, Bob Iger is talking about moving beyond fixing problems, largely left there by Chapek and prompted by the pandemic, into a period where he wants to grow the company in new ways. But to get to these better times, some large project is going to need to click in an unexpected way in 2024, perhaps with more profitable films at the box office, or with streaming bundles that bring in more money overall for Disney and Hulu, or perhaps by selling off some linear assets such as ESPN. But until we get to one of those markers, specifically focused on the media side of Disney's business, I think that in terms of the stock price, we're going to be treading water for a little while, which is nothing to worry about. Since the start of COVID, the media landscape for all studios has been in a state of upheaval. Add into that, Disney didn't have the best leadership during the reign of Chapek. It's going to take some time to correct these problems and to adapt to the new landscape. But I do think we are slowly moving in that direction, which is a series of stories we'll continue to follow each month as part of our monthly updates here on the DHI podcast. I'll be back next Sunday to continue our start of the year updates by looking at stories focused on the Disney battle over Reedy Creek, new offerings at the Florida resort, and some other topics as well. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who support us over on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you will find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us on Bandcamp is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly supporter at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.